There comes a moment in every person's life when the calendar loses its grip on the soul. The date that once marked celebration, anticipation, and the counting of years suddenly becomes just another day. Not from sadness or resignation, but from something far more profound. It's as if the soul awakens from a long dream and realizes that time, as we've been taught to measure it, is merely a construct, a game we agreed to play but forgot we invented. Ibn Arabi, the great Sufi mystic and philosopher, understood this transformation intimately. He knew that when birthdays cease to hold importance, it isn't because we've grown cynical or indifferent to life. Rather, it's because something within us has shifted, expanded, and remembered a truth we've always carried but rarely accessed. The human experience is marked by rituals and celebrations that anchor us to linear time. From the moment we're born, we begin counting. 1 year, 5 years, 21, 40, 60. Each birthday becomes a milestone, a marker of progress or decline, depending on how we've been conditioned to view aging. Society teaches us to celebrate these markers with cakes and candles, gifts and gatherings. We sing songs about growing older. We make wishes as we blow out flames, and we measure our worth against what we've accomplished within these temporal boundaries. But what happens when this ritual begins to feel hollow? When the excitement fades and the date passes with barely a whisper in our consciousness? Most people would attribute this to depression, to a loss of joy, or to the weariness that supposedly comes with age. But what if it's actually the opposite? What if this indifference to birthdays is not a loss at all, but rather the most profound gain a human being can experience? The soul operates on a different frequency than the mind. While the mind is obsessed with beginnings and endings, with birth dates and death dates, the soul exists in a state of eternal presence. It doesn't count years because it doesn't experience time the way our conscious minds do. The soul remembers eternity, even when buried beneath layers of social conditioning and temporal anxiety. When we're young, we're deeply invested in the passage of time because we're still forming our identity within the world's framework. We need those markers to tell us we're progressing, that we're becoming someone. But as consciousness matures, something starts to crack open. The questions change. Instead of asking, "How old am I?" or "What have I achieved by this age?" we begin to ask, "Who am I beyond these measurements, and what exists beneath all these accumulated years?" This shift doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual awakening that often begins with subtle feelings of disconnection from the celebrations and rituals that once brought meaning. You find yourself at your birthday dinner, surrounded by people who love you, and yet there's a strange sensation of watching the scene from outside yourself. The cake arrives, the candles are lit, everyone sings, and you smile and play your part. But internally, something feels distant, as if you're participating in a play whose script no longer resonates with your deepest truth. This isn't sadness. It's not that you're ungrateful or unable to feel joy. It's that you've begun to sense the artificiality of the entire construct. You're starting to remember that you are not your age, not your accomplishments, not even your history. You are something vast and indefinable that has always existed and will continue to exist beyond these temporary forms and measurements. Ibn Arabi spent his life exploring the nature of divine unity and the illusion of separation. His writings delve into the concept that all existence is a manifestation of one infinite reality, and that our individual identities are like waves on an ocean, temporarily distinct but never separate from the whole. When applied to our relationship with time and aging, this philosophy reveals something extraordinary. If we are not separate from the infinite, then we cannot be reduced to the number of times the Earth has circled the Sun since our bodies emerged into this world. That number tells us nothing about who we truly are. It's merely a measurement of one particular form's duration in space and time. But the essence that animates that form, the consciousness that observes through these eyes and feels through this heart, that essence has no birthday because it was never born and will never die. This realization can be unsettling at first. We've built so much of our identity around our personal timeline. We tell our life stories in chronological order. We define ourselves by the decade we're in. We make plans based on how much time we think we have left. When birthdays stop mattering, it can feel like we're losing our anchor, our sense of place in the world. Who are we if not the sum of our years and experiences? But this disorientation is actually the doorway to liberation. It's the necessary dissolution of the false self, the persona we constructed, to navigate a world that demands we identify with form and time. Once we pass through this doorway, we discover an entirely different way of being. We find that our true identity is not diminished by the passing of time, but is actually revealed in its fullness when we stop trying to measure and contain it. The world will continue to celebrate birthdays. Family and friends will still want to mark the occasion, and there's nothing wrong with honoring that. But when the soul remembers who it is, these celebrations take on a different quality. They become less about the individual ego and more about the mystery of existence itself. Less about another year older and more about another moment to marvel at this strange and beautiful journey of consciousness experiencing itself through form. The cake and candles become symbols, not of aging but of presence, not of time passing but of life continuing to manifest in infinite ways. When you stop identifying with your age, you actually become more alive, more present, because you're no longer trapped in the narrative of linear time. You're free to exist in the eternal now, which is the only time that truly exists anyway. There's a particular loneliness that can accompany this awakening. When those around you are still deeply invested in birthdays and milestones, your indifference can be misunderstood. People might think you're depressed or going through a crisis. They might try to cheer you up, to remind you of all you have to celebrate. And how do you explain that you're not sad? That in fact you've never been more at peace, but that you've simply stopped believing in the story of time? How do you tell someone that their well-meaning celebration feels like trying to convince a bird it should be excited about its cage being painted a new color? You can't force this understanding on others. It's something each soul must remember in its own time, through its own journey. So often you simply smile and accept the cake, knowing that your inner experience is yours alone to navigate. But there are moments of recognition. Sometimes you'll meet another soul who has remembered, and no words need to be exchanged. There's a knowing glance, a subtle acknowledgement that passes between you. These encounters are rare but profound. They remind you that you're not alone in this awakening, that countless beings throughout history have passed through this same doorway. The mystics and sages, the poets and philosophers who wrote about timelessness and eternal presence, they all knew this truth. They tried to map it for us in their writings, their teachings, their art. But ultimately, it's something each of us must experience directly. No amount of reading about it can substitute for the actual moment when the soul remembers and the grip of time loosens. What does it mean to live from this place of remembrance? It doesn't mean abandoning practical engagement with the world or refusing to acknowledge the passage of time altogether. Bills still need to be paid, appointments must be kept, seasons change and bodies age. But the relationship to all of it shifts fundamentally. Time becomes a tool we use rather than a prison we inhabit. We can plan for tomorrow while remaining rooted in today. We can honor the cycles and rhythms of existence without being enslaved to them. Most importantly, we stop measuring our worth and progress against temporal markers. The question stops being, have I achieved enough by this age? And becomes, am I living in alignment with my deepest truth in this moment? Success is no longer about what we accumulate or accomplish before we die, but about how fully we embody presence, love, and awareness while we're here. The mind resists this shift because it thrives on continuity and narrative. It wants a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It wants to know where it came from and where it's going. The soul's remembrance threatens this need for narrative coherence. When you realize you're not really the person who was born on a specific date, that you're something far more vast and mysterious, the mind scrambles to regain control. It might throw you into existential crisis, flood you with questions about meaning and purpose. This is the mind's last desperate attempt to maintain its dominance, to convince you that without your personal story and timeline, nothing matters. But if you can sit with this discomfort without running back to the safety of identification with form and time, something extraordinary happens. The crisis dissolves, and what emerges is not meaninglessness, but meaning beyond meaning. Not purpose imposed from outside, but purpose that flows naturally from your essential nature. Children haven't yet learned to be obsessed with time and aging. They live so fully in the present moment that days can feel like eternities and years pass in what seems like minutes. Watch a child at play, completely absorbed in the world they're creating, utterly unconcerned with how old they are or how much time is passing. That's the natural state of consciousness, before it becomes conditioned by society's temporal fixations. Somewhere in the process of growing up, we lose this quality. We start counting and comparing, measuring and worrying. We become future-oriented or past-focused, rarely present. The soul's remembrance is actually a return to that childlike quality of timeless presence, but now informed by adult consciousness and understanding. It's innocence regained through awareness, rather than innocence lost to experience. There's a paradox in all of this. We must live in time while simultaneously transcending it. We exist as both the wave and the ocean, the form and the formless, the temporal being with a birth date and the eternal consciousness that knows no beginning or end. Learning to hold this paradox without collapsing into one side or the other is the great challenge of awakened living. If we reject time and form entirely, we become ungrounded, lost in spiritual bypassing and unable to function in practical reality. If we identify only with time and form, we remain trapped in the suffering that comes from clinging to what must inevitably change and end. The middle way is to honor both aspects of our nature, to live fully as humans while remembering our divine essence, to celebrate birthdays without believing they define us, to engage with the world while knowing we're not of it. Ibn Arabi wrote extensively about the concept of the perfect human, the being who has realized their essential unity with divine reality while still inhabiting human form. This isn't about perfection in the conventional sense, not about being flawless or enlightened in some absolute way. It's about integration, about bringing together all the fragmented aspects of self and realizing their underlying unity. When birthdays stop mattering in the way they once did, it's often a sign that this integration is beginning to occur. The soul is no longer willing to be confined to the narrow definition of self that temporal measurements impose. It's expanding to include more, to remember more, to be more. And in that expansion, paradoxically, we become more fully human, not less. We don't transcend humanity, we fulfill it by recognizing what humans truly are beneath all the conditioning and limitation. The fear of death loosens its grip when we stop identifying with age and time. If I'm not really this body with its specific birth date, then what is there to fear about this body's eventual dissolution? The form will change, as all forms must, but the consciousness that observes through this form is untouched by birth and death. This isn't just philosophical speculation or comforting belief. For those who have genuinely remembered their essential nature, it's direct experiential knowledge. Death becomes not an ending, but a transition, not a loss, but a transformation. And when death loses its terror, life gains incredible richness. No longer paralyzed by the fear of time running out, we're free to be fully present with whatever is arising right now. Each moment becomes precious, not because it's slipping away, but because it's eternally present, part of the infinite now that never began and will never end. The relationships we have with others also transform when we stop identifying with our personal timeline. We're less likely to keep score, to remember old grievances, to hold grudges that tie us to the past. We're more able to meet each person fresh in each encounter, seeing them not through the lens of their history or our accumulated judgments, but as they are right now. This doesn't mean we become naive or lose all discernment. It means we stop relating to people as fixed entities with unchangeable natures and start recognizing the same fluid, mysterious consciousness in them that we've discovered in ourselves. Conflicts and misunderstandings don't disappear, but they're held more lightly. There's less attachment to being right, less need to defend our position, because the position itself is recognized as temporary and ultimately empty of inherent reality. Solitude becomes less lonely, and company less necessary when this shift occurs. The desperate need for external validation and connection that drives so much human behavior begins to quiet down. Not because we've become cold or disconnected, but because we've found the source of connection within ourselves. We're no longer seeking completion from outside because we've remembered we were never incomplete. Relationships become expressions of wholeness rather than attempts to fill an inner void. Love flows more freely because it's not burdened with the weight of need and expectation. We can genuinely be with another without trying to possess them, change them, or use them to shore up our sense of self. This is the love that mystics throughout history have pointed toward, the love that doesn't diminish with time or distance because it's not based on form or circumstance. There will be moments of sadness as you move through this transformation. Sadness for the time spent trapped in illusion, for the years wasted chasing things that could never satisfy, for the relationships damaged by ego and unconsciousness. This sadness is natural and even necessary. It's part of the grieving process that accompanies any significant awakening. We're mourning the death of who we thought we were, even as we celebrate the birth of who we truly are. But this sadness doesn't have the same quality as ordinary depression. It's clean, clear, almost sweet in its poignancy. It doesn't drag us down, but actually helps to clear away what remains of identification with the false self. It's the sadness of beauty recognized, of time appreciated even as its illusory nature is seen through, of love felt more deeply precisely because we know form is temporary. The question might arise, if birthdays don't matter and time is ultimately illusory, why bother with anything? Why make plans, pursue goals, or care about anything that happens in this temporal world? This is the nihilistic trap that the mind can fall into when it grasps these truths conceptually, without embodying them experientially. The answer is simple but profound. We engage fully with life not because it ultimately matters in some absolute sense, but because engagement itself is the expression of consciousness knowing itself through form. We don't need a reason beyond the sheer joy and wonder of existence. Play doesn't need justification. Creation doesn't need to serve a higher purpose. The flower blooms not because it has calculated that blooming is meaningful, but because blooming is its nature. When we stop identifying with time and age, we don't become passive or nihilistic. We become more like the flower, expressing our nature freely and fully, without the burden of having to make it all mean something. Art and creativity take on new dimensions when we live from this place of remembrance. The need to create a lasting legacy, to be remembered after we die, to make something that transcends time, these drives begin to relax. We create not to achieve immortality, but simply to express what's moving through us in this moment. The art becomes purer, less contaminated by ego and ambition. It might be objectively better or worse, more or less successful by worldly standards, but it's more authentic because it's not trying to secure a place in time. It's flowing from timelessness itself. The greatest art has always come from this place, from artists who somehow managed to touch eternity, even while working in temporal mediums. They weren't trying to beat time, but to express it, to capture something of its mystery and beauty. Pain doesn't disappear when the soul remembers who it is. The body still experiences physical discomfort, emotions still arise, challenges still present themselves. But the relationship to pain transforms fundamentally. Pain is no longer interpreted as evidence that something is wrong with us, that we're failing or broken, or not spiritual enough. It's simply pain, arising and passing like everything else in the realm of form. We stop adding layers of suffering on top of the pain through resistance and story-making. We stop asking why me, or how long will this last, and simply allow the experience to be what it is. This doesn't make us masochists or doormats. We still take appropriate action to address suffering where possible, but we're not at war with reality anymore. We're not demanding that existence conform to our preferences and then suffering when it inevitably doesn't. The spiritual seeking that characterized earlier phases of the journey also tends to fall away. When you've remembered who you are, there's nothing left to seek. You might still practice meditation or engage in spiritual disciplines, but the quality changes. You're no longer trying to get somewhere or become someone. The practices become expressions of what already is, rather than techniques to achieve what isn't. This can be confusing for people who are still in the seeking phase. They might interpret your lack of striving as complacency or spiritual laziness, but it's actually the fulfillment that seeking was always pointing toward. The seeker and the sought have merged. The question and the answer have dissolved into each other. What remains is simple presence, simple being, simple awareness of what is. Community and belonging shift in interesting ways as well. When you're identified with your personal timeline and life story, you naturally gravitate toward people of similar age, background, and life stage. You define yourself through these affiliations, but when age becomes irrelevant, these boundaries soften. You might find yourself equally comfortable with someone much younger or much older, or with people whose life experiences are radically different from your own. The connection happens at a deeper level, soul to soul, rather than story to story. This doesn't mean you abandon all your old friendships or communities. It means they're held more lightly, appreciated for what they offer without being clung to as sources of identity. You can move in and out of various social circles without losing yourself because you're no longer defining yourself through external affiliations. The natural world becomes a more profound teacher when we step out of obsessive time consciousness. Trees don't celebrate birthdays. Rivers don't worry about aging. Mountains don't measure their worth by how long they've existed. They simply are, expressing their nature moment to moment, season to season, age to age. Spending time in nature helps us remember this way of being. We absorb through direct experience what all the spiritual teachings are pointing toward. The bird singing at dawn isn't thinking about how many dawns it has left. The flower opening to the sun isn't comparing itself to the flowers that bloomed last spring. There's just this magnificent, continuous arising of life expressing itself through infinite forms, and we are part of that same arising. When we recognize this, birthdays become as arbitrary as celebrating the number of times a particular wave has crashed against the shore. There's a lightness that comes with this realization, a humor that wasn't accessible before. We can laugh at the cosmic joke of taking ourselves so seriously, of believing that these brief appearances in form are who we really are. We can smile at the elaborate structures we built to make sense of time and identity, not from cynicism, but from gentle amusement. Life becomes less heavy, less urgent, even as it becomes more vivid and immediate. The paradox is that when we stop believing birthdays matter, we actually become more capable of genuine celebration. Not celebration of age or achievement, but celebration of existence itself, of the sheer improbability and mystery of consciousness appearing as this particular configuration of matter and energy, however temporarily. And yet, with all this understanding, there are still moments when the old patterns resurface. A birthday approaches and suddenly you find yourself caring again, wondering where the years went, feeling the pull of time's story. This doesn't mean you've lost your realization or failed somehow. It means you're human, living in a body with a nervous system conditioned over decades to respond to certain triggers and symbols. The remembrance we're speaking of isn't a permanent state that, once achieved, never wavers. It's more like a ground of being that you learn to return to again and again, even as the surface of life continues to ripple with thoughts, emotions, and conditioned responses. Each time you notice you've been caught in the story of time and age, each time you remember to return to presence, the pattern weakens slightly. Not through force or rejection, but through gentle, patient awareness. The question of legacy also resolves itself differently when birthdays lose their grip. The obsession with what we'll leave behind, how we'll be remembered, whether our life will have mattered, these concerns arise from the fear that when this body dies, we die with it. But if we're not fundamentally identified with this particular form and its timeline, then the whole question of legacy becomes less pressing. We still care about the impact of our actions, still want to contribute positively to the world, but we're not driven by the desperate need to cheat death through accomplishment or memory. We understand that our true legacy is not the specific things we create or achieve, but the quality of consciousness we embody and transmit simply by being. Every interaction, every moment of genuine presence, every act of love, these ripple out in ways we can never fully track or measure. The butterfly effect isn't just about physical causation, it's about how consciousness affects consciousness, how one person's awakening creates space for others to awaken. Money and material success also come into clearer perspective. When you're measuring your life by temporal milestones, there's always this sense of needing to have achieved certain financial markers by certain ages. If you haven't made your first million by 30, if you're not retired by 65, if you don't have the house or car or lifestyle appropriate to your age, then somehow you're behind or failing. This creates enormous stress, and drives people to compromise their integrity, their health, their relationships, in pursuit of markers that are ultimately arbitrary. But when birthdays stop mattering, this whole framework collapses. You might still work, still earn money, still enjoy material comforts, but you're not using them to measure your worth or prove you're keeping pace with time's demands. You understand that wealth, like age, tells you nothing about the true value of a life. The richest person in the graveyard is no more alive than the poorest. Teachers and teachings also lose some of their hold when this shift occurs. Earlier on the path, we often seek out gurus, books, workshops, techniques, anything that might help us understand or achieve awakening. We accumulate knowledge, compare traditions, debate philosophies. All of this has its place and purpose. But when the soul remembers who it is, the need for external authority diminishes. Not because we've learned everything or become arrogant, but because we've found the teacher within. We recognize that every teaching was only ever pointing back to this direct knowing that's now arising from our own depths. We can still appreciate wisdom when we encounter it, still learn from others, but we're not giving our power away to external sources. We've taken responsibility for our own consciousness and its evolution. Forgiveness becomes simpler and more natural when we're not holding on to time. So much of what we find unforgivable in ourselves and others is tied to the idea that past actions define present identity. I did this terrible thing 10 years ago, therefore I am a terrible person. Or they hurt me in the past, therefore they are hurtful people. But if we understand that identity is fluid and time is less solid than it appears, then the past loses some of its determining power. We can acknowledge that certain actions were taken, certain harms were done, without making them into fixed definitions of who someone is now. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or pretending abuse didn't happen. It means seeing clearly that the person who did those things was a particular configuration of consciousness in a particular moment, and that configuration has already changed simply by virtue of time passing and awareness evolving. The person you're refusing to forgive may no longer exist in any meaningful sense. Sleep and dreams provide interesting glimpses into timeless consciousness. In dreams, we can live entire lifetimes in what is measured as mere minutes of clock time. We can be different ages, exist in different eras, experience past and future as simultaneous. The dream world doesn't obey the same temporal laws as waking reality, and yet it feels completely real while we're in it. Some mystics suggest that waking life is not fundamentally different from dreaming, that it's all consciousness, creating temporary experiences within itself. From this view, birthdays are like markers we create within the dream to help us navigate, but they have no reality beyond the consensus we maintain while the dream continues. When we wake up from a dream, we don't celebrate the birthday of the character we were playing in the dream because we recognize it was never really us. The soul's remembrance is something like this waking up from the dream of being a separate self with a fixed history and predetermined future. Seasons and cycles take on new meaning when we're less identified with linear aging. Rather than seeing life as a straight line from birth to death, we recognize the spiral nature of existence. We return again and again to similar themes and lessons, but at different levels of understanding. The cycle of seasons in nature mirrors this spiral of consciousness. Each spring isn't just a repeat of the last spring, it's a new manifestation of the eternal principle of renewal. Each autumn isn't just another ending, it's a unique expression of the rhythm of letting go. When we align ourselves with these natural cycles, rather than the artificial construct of calendar years and birthdays, we find a different kind of wisdom. We learn when to expand and when to contract, when to act and when to rest, not based on our age, but based on what's alive in us in this season of our being. The simplicity that emerges from this understanding can be startling. So much of our lives is complicated by time anxiety, by the fear that we're running out of moments, that we need to hurry and accomplish and experience before it's too late. When this anxiety dissolves, life becomes remarkably simple. What needs to be done becomes obvious. What can be released reveals itself clearly. We stop juggling multiple agendas and trying to optimize every moment. We trust that if we're fully present with what's here now, whatever needs to unfold will unfold in its own timing. This simplicity isn't simplistic or naive. It's the profound simplicity on the far side of complexity, the clarity that emerges when confusion has been fully exhausted. And so we come full circle, back to that moment when the birthday arrives, and you realize it means nothing like it once did. Not because life has become meaningless, but because meaning has shifted from the temporal to the eternal, from the personal to the universal, from the story to the presence that exists beneath all stories. You might still cut a cake, still accept the wishes of loved ones, still mark the occasion in some outer way, but internally you're resting in a space where there is no counting, no measuring, no comparing. You're home in yourself, not as this aging body with its accumulating years, but as the consciousness that has always been and will always be, wearing this particular form for this particular dance through time and space. Ibn Arabi knew this truth, lived from this truth, taught this truth, and now perhaps you're beginning to remember it too. The silence that follows this remembrance is not empty but full of potential, full of presence, full of the mystery that cannot be named or contained by concepts like age or time. In that silence, birthdays continue to come and go, but they're seen for what they really are. Arbitrary markers in an endless expanse, waves on an infinite ocean, brief expressions of something vast and eternal that we've always been but somehow forgot. Until we remembered. Until the soul recognized itself again. Until the illusion of time loosened its grip, and we found ourselves standing outside of years and ages, outside of beginnings and endings, simply here, simply now, simply being what we've always been beneath all the counting and celebrating and forgetting. This is what happens when birthdays stop mattering. This is what the soul remembers when it remembers who it is.